Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the International Euphonium Summit Living History Series with our guest for his third in series, David Werden. Thanks for coming back on and being part of our series and part of our cohort.
Certainly. It's been my pleasure, and I've learned a lot as we talk. So this is great fun.
It is. It's quite exceptional. And for those that are watching this now and haven't been able to listen to the podcast just yet, take a look over there without David saying anything else. There's an Easter egg in the picture. If someone can identify that without hearing this podcast and the answer to that and list it below, put the answer below in the segment below here. And you can find out more information on David Werden and all his other interviews in series with this at internationaleuphoniumsummit.com/David-Werden. And for now, as we move and maneuver toward launching the International Euphonium Summit, the actual virtual each year, and will be established with a portfolio soon to be at farmfordreams.com. And that's to be updated soon. All the links as they go live will be listed down below. Make sure you subscribe and just follow this journey. Thank you again. And as we covered in the podcast, at the end of that last short sequence, the getting to prepare for the tour of Russia with your college band and that sequence.
Did you want me to recap the one story about the
Euphonium
solo?
Let's go ahead. Okay. Yeah.
Because that was a monumental experience for me at the time.
Perfect.
The background on that is in my freshman year in college, the University of Iowa band was going to Russia. That was a very big deal. We got a lot of people all of a sudden who decided they would get their masters that year who were out teaching, but thought that'd be a good year to come back and get their masters so they could play in the band and have that experience. I auditioned for the band and I made it, but after several weeks, I began to realize how much it was going to cost to go. Some costs were covered, but a lot of them weren't. And I had to back out. I just couldn't afford it. So the band left and I stayed home and had some good experiences there in the other bands that were working. But during the rehearsals for the band, the first euphonium player, who was Dick Butler, and he was a fine trombone euphonium player. He'd been in the Army band, I believe, had studied with Falcone and Harold Brash, and was just an amazing player. We got to the whole second suite, and he played the solo in that. And I was sitting third chair, so I was one chair away yet from him. And I felt like my head was sort of being knocked over as he was playing so loud. The term came up in the Coast Guard band about our bass trombone player blow drying the person's hair in front of him. It kind of felt like that kind of experience. And I thought, my gosh, why is he playing so loud? Well, then that came and went. And then the band went on tour. They came home and did sort of a celebration concert when they got home to play some of the music they had just done on tour. And I was in the audience, of course, for that. And they did the whole second suite, which I was very happy about. I liked this piece a lot. And when Dick played that solo, when I was out in the audience, it sounded perfect. It didn't sound too loud. It sounded pretty and musical and was as loud as it needed to be. So it was clear who was the boss right then, so to speak, who had the important line right then. And that made a huge impression on me on the difference, especially with the euphonium, when our bells are pointing up and to the right. And we were sitting at the time, from the conductor's point of view, we were about a third of the way toward the right-hand side of the band, which means our bells are pointing backwards some. And that was a situation we encountered a lot when I was in the Coast Guard as well, and other bands, that you often are not pointing in the ideal direction to get sound out to the audience. And it takes a lot of work to do that. The trick, of course, is to learn to play very loudly, which Dick had learned to do, without sounding loud, without sounding like you're playing a fortissimo when the solo is marked perhaps mezzo forte and dolce or something. You want to have the smooth song effect of a folk song, which Cole's got that melody from. And you want to have that come to the audience as a pretty song, not that this guy's playing really loud and now I can hear it. So you want to have the smoothness and the delicate tone and such. And that was, again, it's kind of a remarkable experience for me, because up close, it sounded like he was way overdoing it. Up front, no, not at all. And in that same solo, I do talk about this on a video, one of the instructional videos I have on YouTube. In the
Put the
second
link
phrase,
below.
what's that? Oh,
I'll
yeah,
put
yeah.
the link to that video below.
Thank you. There's a ba da da dee da 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 dum dum dum. So you've got 3 half notes in cut time, and those are not to be really accented. They're just part of the melody. But out front, I've heard that line often played by people, and it sounds like ba da da dee da 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 ba da da, like that. So you need to learn to push those out. And again, that's something I learned after this experience with Dick Butler. I didn't realize he was doing that, but you need to push them with your gut more, not with your tongue. You don't want to smack them, ta, ta, ta. That'd be the wrong effect. You've got to go, huh, 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 behind it in order for those notes to be heard, that you actually are separating them. Because just the tongue separation on those is not going to be enough unless you actually shorten each half note, which you don't want to do. So anyway, there's a lot of things like that that we can learn. I'm very thankful to have that experience that I did have. In fact, if I'd gone on the tour, I never would have gotten to hear the band out front. So I would have thought he was playing too loud the whole time. So it was, in a way, a learning experience anyway for me in that one regard. So that was an opportunity I missed. And fortunately, the Coast Guard gave me the chance to go to Russia in 1989. So we did get to go over there with that band. So later I at least got to see the country and see what it was about. In the 60s, when I was in college, there was all these mysteries about Russia. We didn't know nearly as much. There was no internet back then, so we couldn't learn a lot of things. And I was not a world traveler by any means. So they were preparing us for what you might have to do to travel in places where there was no laundry in the hotel and things like that, how you have to actually, they recommended certain kinds of shirts you could buy that were good drip dry shirts, which is a term they don't use much anymore, I don't think, but shirts you could wear by laundering them in the sink, right, and have them be okay for the rest of the week, whatever. So anyway, I learned a few things like that along the way as they were instructing us. But when we stayed home, I had the experience of the conductor Mark Kelly, who was one of the more experienced conductors, I'll say. I don't want to say old, because I'm probably older than he is, or he was then, but had a lot of experience conducting bands, and he had his own style. And I remember, I think it was Mark, and I've never tried to be a serious conductor, partly because I've had too many complaints about conductors in my brain, ways that could probably make things easier for us, and didn't choose to do so. But a big problem when you've got a whole band, especially in the university bands where they're large ensembles, you've got your stick up here you're conducting with, and you want the band to play together. And that's no problem if you're just, beating time and it's moving along. But when there's a pause in the music or a tempo change, and we now have a new entrance that has to be here, well, it wasn't together to his satisfaction. And Mr. Kelly would say, no, it's got to be, you got to follow my beat. So I want the attack to be right here. Well, I didn't know. I saw no difference between, other than the height. I didn't see any motion difference. I thought, okay. So, but I guess it worked. Anyway, so in my college experience, actually, I had the first year or two, I think it was 2 years, we had Fred Ebbs, who was rather legendary among Midwest band directors. And he was a very stern conductor. We had Frank Pearsall for the rest of my term there for the main band. And he was a super nice guy, just very sweet person. Could be harsh when he needed to, but he was just a very nice guy, totally different personalities. Then I had Mark Kelly. So I had 3 different band directors, not to mention the directors of the ensembles, the brass choirs and so on, who were different as well. Some were the grad assistants. One was the trombone professor, who was a very nice conductor and very great musician. A lot of learning chances there. And as a euphonium player in the 1960s at a major state university, I didn't have a euphonium professor to study with, and there was no seat for that there. So I had, other than this the year of my recital, my senior recital. That year, I got the professor I was just talking about. He was a trombone player, but he did play euphonium pretty well, and he taught really well, especially on musical things, which I felt was what I learned most from his year. But I was there 5 years. That's a long story too. I won't go into right now. But
Why not? That'd be perfect.
okay, I'll make it a short story. I was dumb, not IQ wise. I was a dumb kid. Didn't know how to apply myself. Didn't know how to, work my life basically, because I didn't read the catalog before I went. I just counted on my advisor, and my advisor was a very nice horn player, but not a very good faculty advisor for a student. And he let me get into all these things I shouldn't have, courses that didn't account toward my major really. So anyway, so after 5 years, I did graduate.
So what did you go into the university as a major as, and then did that ever change?
No, I was a music education major when I went in. That's what I came out as. But I saw some other, ethics. I thought that sounded fun. Let's take the ethics course. Well, it turns out I was already satisfied in whatever, would it be humanities? I'm not even sure what section that would be. But it just sounded interesting. So I took that one, and several other mistakes I made along the way. So I learned a little about life, at least during that time. And anyway, during those 5 years, I had Professor Hill 1 year. The other 4 years, I had 4 different teachers. And that was actually a rather remarkable experience in terms of pedagogical knowledge. I got out of there with 5 different concepts of teaching people that I could learn from. And I had one guy was a bass trombone player who'd been in the Woody Herman band, and he was a great player. The other was Robert Wathe, was a tuba player, but also did quite well in euphonium. I had another trombone player, Henry Howie, who again played euphonium. And the one really interesting one was Arthur Swift, who was the other. We had a primary trumpet professor, but then Arthur Swift was the other one there. And Arthur was a troubleshooter. He didn't say that he did too with me, but he had actually considered it part of his gift and his mission to help students that have problems, physical problems, things they do wrong. So when he'd hear somebody that sounded bad with a really bad attack, the way you might build up pressure before you release. So instead of going ta, they went ta like that. They build up pressure behind the tongue. He'd practice doing all these things wrong so he could demonstrate it to students and say, here's how it sounds. And that also gave him insight into what they're doing physically. What do I have to do with my tongue and my mouth to sound like that student sounds? So he actually was quite good at straightening people out that had problems. So anyway,
and that was Arthur Swift?
It was, Arthur Swift, I believe was his name. I think, well, it was Swift. I think it was Arthur. Great player. But as it happens, I think if I had to pick his most excellent skill, that'd be helping to straighten kids out. Because that our primary teacher, the primary trumpet professor, was known to not be very good at that. He played wonderfully, but he never had problems playing. He just sort of picked up the horn and it always worked for him. So therefore, he had trouble if a student had a punchy attack that wasn't working well. He had no idea why that was. So they might spend a semester then with Arthur, and come back to John for the rest of the major, perhaps. So I heard the same thing about Maurice Andre, by the way, the great French trumpet player, that it's always just been easy for him. So if you want to study with him, you go there to learn the literature and to learn beautiful musicality and interpretations. You don't go there to learn how to play the trumpet. So there's different kinds of teachers. And like I said, I benefited from a rather diverse group. So that was great fun for me.
So take us through the 5th and final year of your music ed degree there.
Okay, the 5th and final year was actually my second senior year. My first senior year is when I did my recital. So my second senior year was a rather bad time to be a college student. There were a lot of protests about the war. There were, that was the year I had to face up to some courses I'd sort of put off. For example, I had to take vocal techniques. So I took that one that year, and it seemed like there were 1 or 2 others as well. So I just wasn't enjoying myself much. I hated to sing in front of people. Now I don't mind it. I mean, I've learned more as I sing in lessons. You have to do that. especially in master classes. You can't just pick up your horn all the time. Sometimes you have to save time and just sing what you want to hear. So I've gotten more comfortable with that. My voice has gotten perhaps better at doing it. But she did teach me a few things, the instructor. One about using your diaphragm muscles, and there's controversy over what that actually is. But the fact is, she got me to think more about that and supporting the tone properly. And I learned from her that I had a Midwest twang in my voice. I didn't know that I did. I don't have an accent. Those guys in Boston have an accent. The guys in California do, and down south do. I don't have an accent. Well, apparently I did. But that semester I had her was my final semester. And if the listeners haven't learned about Kent State and the protests there and the tragedy there, that would be a good thing to study on, just to learn history. But like some of the protests we've seen here, they can be dangerous if you're walking around one. And there were sit-ins, there were students starting fires, places, things like that. But after Kent State, where there were actually there was multiple students killed by, I think it was a National Guard troop, if I remember right. There was a big confrontation, and somebody thought there was an order to fire, and there wasn't. It was a tragedy. And the reason you want to avoid those things, I'm not sure if it was actually anybody's fault or just something that happens. That's why you don't want to get in those situations. But anyway, that happened just before the end of the semester. And the protests were so bad on campus, most places, including Iowa, that they told us we didn't have to take finals. We'd get whatever grade we had based on the work we'd done so far, which in my case I don't think it was either a loss or a gain. I don't think I was a student who knew very well how to cram, so I wasn't hoping for finals to bring my grade up a little bit higher. I was pretty consistent all the way through the semester, I suppose. So we didn't have finals that year, which was very strange. That same year, I was very eligible for the draft. They had a lottery system where you were given a number, mm-hmm. and the lower the number, the more likely you were to get drafted. And the numbers went up to 365, and I was 63. So very good likelihood of being drafted. I took my draft physical that year, and that was sobering. A little different experience for a kid who hadn't done much at that point, to go up and be facing that. But I found that I did very well on that geometric construction test they give you. Right, they were all set to, they were set to send me to engineering school after I got through that, if I came in. But I didn't see myself as a soldier type. I wasn't good physically and whatnot. And I'd never been an athlete. Nothing wrong with my body. I was a decent strength and whatnot. I couldn't do a layup shot in basketball to save my life. I mean, I had no coordination in that sense. So basic training could have been interesting for me. But I decided, well, I need to take some charge over this. I wasn't going to go to Canada to avoid it. I wasn't that type. But I wanted to use what I thought I did in life, which is play music. So I looked into the bands. And I learned about the Coast Guard band because a buddy of mine from high school, who was a year ahead of me all the way, had left school early to join the Coast Guard band. And he told me all about it. I found out later from him he had a very bad experience there himself. He hated it because he hated the war. He didn't hate the band. He just hated the whole war idea. And he was a problem for the band director sometimes. And anyway, but I'll give him credit. He gave me absolutely no hint of that in the letters he sent me as I was asking about this. He gave a very balanced, and what I found to be true when I got there. He said, here's the downside, here's the upside. And by golly, he was right on. So that sounded like I liked the job. I liked the sound of it. I liked the fact it wasn't in Washington, D.C. I came from Davenport, which is about 100,000 people. And that was okay with me, but the whole Washington metro area just didn't appeal to me very much. So I targeted the Coast Guard band, but they didn't have a good system for auditions back then. It was taking them a long time to get back to me, and I was getting concerned. So I did send a tape out to the Army band as well. And they invited me out to audition, and I unfortunately didn't know they were going to pay my way. That I got lost in the communication somehow, or I would have gone. But so I was thinking, oh my gosh, I borrowed money to go to the Coast Guard audition. Could I borrow more money now to go to this one? And in the meantime, I heard back from the Coast Guard that, yeah, you're okay, come on in. So that's what I chose to do. But so that was all part of my senior year. It was an exciting year, and not the best year of my life in terms of the whole protest experience, and the whole mood of the country was not very happy back then.
So that all happened during the second senior year.
Correct. Yeah.
After your first year senior recital, you're finding yourself second year, no finals. Like at what point of your second senior year did you start looking at that military band positions and stuff like that and start preparing for those? And how did you prepare for those?
I only had an inkling of what my friend had been through. I can't remember how I heard, if he wrote me a letter or what, after the fact, just out of the blue. Before I actually got into that year, I had some inkling that there was a Coast Guard band. I didn't even know there was one, first of all, because you never heard about it. Well, in Iowa, we didn't hear about the Coast Guard band or the Coast Guard at all, as far as that goes. So I wouldn't have known about it that way, except for David. And I knew about that one, but I frankly didn't start looking at it. I wasn't good at planning ahead. I didn't start looking at it probably till the first part of my second semester. I started thinking about it then, as reality began to sink in, that I was going to get out, and I was going in the military. One way or the other, I was going to go in. So now, okay, that's the fact. What are you going to do about it? So at some point that sank in, and I started talking to people a little bit about it. We did have a recruiter come through, 2 years before that. I think he was from the Air Force band, the Omaha band at the time. They had a band in Omaha. He was a recruiter that came through, and he said, well, our teacher told us, go and play for him if you want to. He'll be happy to listen to you and tell you what you think. Well, he was all set to hire me. That was my sophomore year, I think. And it was a good experience because he had me do some sight reading, and I was a good sight reader. It doesn't scare me at all. And he gave me the piece that was in my favorite key for some reason, which was in treble clef G minor. I used to practice some pieces in high school when I was just playing around that happened to be in G minor. So I just, in terms of trying different notes and trying to learn to ad lib, which I never did, by the way, I fooled around a lot of G minor. So, and it was 16th note, fast scales and whatnot in 6/8, and it just didn't look scary at all. I just played right through it. And he said, yeah. So he was all set to hire me, but not really. He actually told me, "You want to finish school?" He said it wasn't like some of the recruiters you see on Private Benjamin or some of the movies. They're just out to make a quota. He was honest with me and straightforward. He said, "Finish school and then come back and talk to us if you want. We'd be happy to talk to you." And I suppose I could have, but by that time, now that was since I was in the 5-year plan. Sophomore year is what's this finger down here, so I had 3 more years after that yet. So,
but that was the Air Force band.
Yes, yeah. And I'm sure I would have liked it. I learned later the Air Force had a very nice music program, and their bands were quite good. The post bands, and of course the Air Force band itself was very good. But as I say, that's not the path I chose. I decided to look into the Coast Guard band. I just had that focus in my head because of my friend, and that sounded like the deal for me. And I'm glad it worked out. I was on pins and needles for quite a while, but it did work out.
That's
now,
awesome.
Shall I go into that next?
Yes, please.
Okay. So now I didn't know anybody really close who was in the military. I didn't have an older brother who was in the military or something like that. I did have an older brother-in-law who was in the Air Force, but I'd hardly met him at that point. So, because he was deployed. And by the time I did get to know him, when he was moved back closer, he was no longer in the Air Force. So I didn't learn much about the military from him or anybody else. So I didn't have an idea what it was like. They sent me down. They told me that, the Coast Guard told me that when I came in, I'd be coming in as an E6. I wasn't sure what that was, but they said, "Oh, it's a first class petty officer." Okay. "But you'll be wearing chief's uniform." I said, "What?" Didn't know what that was either. That's the E7 uniform, but they wanted the whole band to look alike. And the differentiation there was the E7 wore the more the officer style, where the E6s had more the sailor type, clothing at the time. And they wanted the whole band to have one uniform appearance. So you came in at E6, you put on a chief's uniform without the chief's collar brass, and then you did your thing. So I sort of know a little bit about that. They sent me to St. Louis to be recruited because there was no Coast Guard recruiter in Iowa. And then I drove out, and they told me about they would pay for the move at a mobile home at the time that they paid to move out there. So I went out, and the Coast Guard had no basic training at all at that time. They still don't. They have a indoctrination that started before I left. It was about a 2-week indoctrination program in Cape May, their training base, where you get your uniforms issued and things like that, learn about military protocols, learn saluting people is important, that kind of stuff. Then you get sent to the band after that. But I just went right into the band. So they immediately sent me up to the tailor to get uniforms, although I had some that my friend had left when he left. He left me his locker and uniforms and whatnot. And so I had some that I could wear. So they fitted me out, and in 2 days, I was off to Martha's Vineyard for the band's first gig. It was a parade and concert situation once we got there. So, okay, fine. I've done both. I've done parades, I've done concerts. And we got there, and we started down the parade. And, and you've all seen college marching bands, I'm sure. They march with high steps, right? So when you march, you lift your leg up so it's like this, so the top of your thigh is parallel to the ground.
Right.
Shin pointing straight down, your toes are supposed to point down. You march faster than military bands usually.
So you did.
What's that?
So I'm assuming that sometimes I get into trouble by assuming like this, but I'm gonna take a stab at it just because. So the military training in indoctrination and everything, they didn't cover actual marching formations and stuff like that at all.
They didn't have the indoctrination when I came in. I went straight to the band. So no, there was nothing.
Wow.
So, and it was, like I said, the whole recruitment system back then was very loose. The band had only 4 years before that, I believe, become a congressional band. Before that, it was the academy band. So their workload was a lot different. Their responsibilities were different. So anyway, we're on Martha's Vineyard. We're doing our first parade, and I'm marching in the front row. And I had my King Euphonium with me, the front valves and the bells over on this side, pointing forward. And I'm doing, I did learn not to high step, which I really didn't like, actually. I mean, it was more work to high step. But when you high step, you come down on the ball of your foot.
Yeah. When
you walk down the street, you come down on your heel. So my mouthpiece is bouncing around like this, as I'm doing what I'm not used to doing, just walking. But I was doing this thing as I was going, like we did in high school. And the bass trombone player kept reaching over and grabbing my bell. He'd hold his horn and reach over and grab my bell, so I couldn't do that. No, don't do that. And it took me a while to break the habit. But by my second parade or so, I was better at not doing that. But they drill those things into you really hard when you're in college. My experience in college was much tighter discipline than I had when I got in the Coast Guard. Those guys are serious when you're in college marching band, for the football games. So, Anyway, but I got to see Martha's Vineyard. That was kind of cool on my first trip. Got to ride the ferry boat and stuff, which I don't think I ever had before that. And gradually learned how things work. We got back to the academy then after that, and went right into the summer concert series, where they did a concert a week at the academy. Every Sunday there was a concert, and it had a good local following because they'd been doing that for some years before I got there. And it was great music. That's where that first summer, I started to think, my original thought was I'd serve 4 years. That was the contract for enlisting. Serve 4 years, get out and go be a college or a high school band director, which is what I'd planned to be. And I enjoyed playing so much in the band. I thought, this is fun, because we had new music every week. And we had some of all the Die Meistersinger and Tannhauser and those kind of things, Fingal's Cave and Broadway tunes and marches and all these kind of things that are just fun music to play. And also, frankly, I got bored in college preparing like the Passacaglia and Fugue. That was one of the pieces on a concert we worked 2 months on. Well, the euphonium part's not that much fun in that piece. It's not challenging, other than to play in good style and intonation and stuff, but there's no technical challenges. But here I was getting challenged every week to work up pieces I'd never played before that had technique. You had to be able to play notes and stuff, fast notes that went by quick. So So that was great fun. The first concert, again, this piece has followed me. The first concert, one of the pieces was the whole second suite. So we are there in the first rehearsal. And again, this sort of shows you that the organization wasn't all it could be. But at the time, we had two players. The other guy who was there was the assistant director of the band. He'd been in by that time probably 20 years. He was a master chief. Didn't know what that was exactly, but I know it was important because he had more stars on his collar. And so I'm sitting there, we're playing along, and we get to the, let's see, the trombone was boom, 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 boom. They start that scale before the solo. So as that happens, I put my horn down and wait to listen to the guy next to me. And he jerks his horn up and plays the solo. And think, well, it doesn't sound very good, but you know, it was only a rehearsal. And he said afterwards, "You're supposed to play the solos." I was a principal, nobody told me. But, so he was a great player as far as technique and whatnot. I mean, he played anything the band threw in front of him, he could play on his con with short action valves and stuff. And he liked the horn. He knew all the music because he played it all before. And he was always in the right place at the right time, that kind of stuff. But he was not a strong, soloistic type player. So that it made him nervous because he never had to do that. So anyway, so that was an interesting lesson. And nobody told me. You don't want to assume, when you come in. I was a shy guy. I wasn't going to assume I was a principal player, just having started with all these. And I figured there was more of in some bands it is, in some bands it isn't so much based on seniority. In the Coast Guard, at the time, it sort of was and sort of wasn't. And in later years, it mostly wasn't. It was based on who was the best player. And in some of the military bands, it wasn't that way. So, but I didn't know what to expect. Anyway, so it was a fun first summer, good learning experience for me. And I gave Art a good learning experience that he should have talked to me perhaps before we started playing. But anyway, then later, I think still in my first year, there was a trombone player who actually was hired because he was a good keyboard player. So the band needed, for the dance band, they needed a pianist, and for the Dixieland band, he played what was called a Cordovox, which was sort of an accordion with an external speaker, but he used a belly-based keyboard, like an accordion does. And that was his primary instrument. But of course, what's that?
Kind of like a guitar?
No, it was more like an accordion shape and everything, but it didn't make the sound, I don't think, through the box itself. It wasn't a squeeze box. It made all of its sound, I believe, through the amplifier and stuff that was before it, I believe. I wasn't paying a lot of attention, first of all, because his back was to me, and he was holding the thing in front of him, so I couldn't see what he was doing. But anyway, that was Phil Goldblatt, just a super sweet guy. But he had to play an instrument, because when the band goes on parade, you've got people who are, typically in a band, you might have an oboe player. And in our band, she played the glockenspiel. The instruments you don't use in marching, that are more concert band instruments, you find something else for them to do. And in this case, they had Phil play trombone. Well, Phil had a little bit of shaky sound. He didn't have the solid breath control that you might have if you'd grown up as a wind player. And they found out that trombone pointing straight out was maybe not the best thing for him. So they switched him to the euphonium section. So I had Art and me and Phil in the section. And Phil he was almost as senior as Art was. He'd been in for a long time. He was a senior chief, I think, at the time. But just a super sweet guy and very unassuming. And he taught me a lot about life. I sort of adopted him as my father in the band because he was just good at giving advice. Either solicited or not, he was very gentle about it when he chose to offer you advice you hadn't asked for, which probably saved me from a couple oopsies along the way. But he was also really, really interested. Now, this guy, his career was made. He didn't have to do anything except sit in the section and, survive, really. They weren't going to fire him then. And he was doing his primary job very well. They still liked how he played, for the keyboard stuff. But he wanted to learn. He wanted to do the job well. So he'd ask me questions all the time about how to do this and how to do that. And he'd go home and practice. And he finally bought himself a tape recorder so he could hear himself practice and play it back. And he gave me a revelation that I took with me after that. He said, I'll clean up the language just slightly, but he said, he said, Dave, it's the darndest thing. He said that the recorder don't record your intentions. It only records the results. So that was, I thought, kind of brilliant, actually. It's very shocking when you first hear your voice on recorder too. It doesn't sound anything like you think it does. It's one of those revelations. But he was a hardworking guy who unfortunately died after about 5 years of my time there. He died of a heart attack, rather unexpectedly, and it was just a shame. He was just such a sweet guy to have there, and a stable influence in my life. But these things happen, and the band went on as it always does, and we hired, at that point, Art was retiring as well around that same time. So rather than leave me alone in the section, they hired the euphonium player. And that would be the second euphonium player they actually, I believe, auditioned as a euphonium player. And that was Dennis Winter when he came in. And Dennis had been, he'd grown up in Ohio. And he came in and played the audition, and he played it on his Constellation that he had. And we had the whole second suite solo as part of the audition. And I swear I've never heard that played prettier. It wasn't really as loud as it would have had to be, or as bold as you might want it, but it was the most beautiful sounding. He just had this way of playing beautiful melodies. If you've ever heard our tuba quartet play Greensleeves, Dennis starts the melody on that. It starts just him and nobody else. Or the Atlantic Tuba Quartet album, the same thing. And they're on YouTube. You can find that on my channel.
Which
he
is
just had
at
this
the end of
sweet.
this video up here.
What's that?
The link to your channel will be up in one of the corners here.
Good. Because it is, if you go to my channel, just outright, you'll find a whole bunch of recordings that aren't euphonium, so it can be kind of confusing. Because doing a lot of historic recordings of old cornet players and bands, and I've got a Doc Severinsen collection that's rather extensive on there and things. So anyway, so Dennis was a very nice partner. He became my best friend in the band, and he was enthusiastic. He had this inner joy and enthusiasm about music that was contagious. He was partly, or probably mostly, responsible, because I really did respect his opinion, for the fact that there was a Coast Guard tuba quartet. I was just kind of, I'm not sure if I wanted to bother with that. But Dennis got me talked into it, and that became something we kept then until I got out of the band, and it kept going after that. So it was obviously a good thing. Dennis was largely responsible for getting the band's recital series going, which was the first among the major service bands of a member-led recital series. So the only thing the administration did was offer support, like advertising and things like that, and making sure that they'd support us when we needed the hall. But other than that, it was guys in the band who were, by the way, E6s. They were the starting grade in the band. 2 guys who were running the recital series, and they were responsible for doing everything, programs. For creating them. Again, the print shop would do that for us, but create the programs, program the recitals, get the participants to volunteer to do it. And that series is still going on now to this day as well. So Dennis was part of that. Just a great person to have around. And he died he had early onset Alzheimer's and died way too prematurely. And we'll miss him. He was just a nice guy. We had a fight now and then, but I just didn't agree with him always. And I'd be stubborn and he'd be stubborn, but we'd get over it.
That's awesome.
Anyways, he was a great partner, and he really helped me learn some things. And it was Dennis who came to mind, Nicholas, when I was talking to you about, I wanted to thank you for suggesting I put those diagrams of the compensating system in action on YouTube. That was the kind of thing Dennis used to do for me. Because Dennis was very creative about thinking and promotions and whatnot. And he would say to me that, Dave, he said, you play great, but he said, you need me as your manager. Then he'd be out there doing all these things. So he was right. We never did that, but he was right.
That's awesome. That's a great way to segue into the after review of our during the podcast after this segment, and to break for your 4th in series at this point. That's a great way to end this 3rd in series with David Werden. And for more information, you can check out his channel, which will be up in this corner right here. Gotta love the background, right? And find out more information at the link below, internationaleuphoniumsummit.com/David-Werden. If you go to our YouTube, like actual channel and subscription page, subscribe, please. That'd be awesome. And show your support. If you want to continue and start your series even, and be part of our cohort and what we have going here, the link is in the introduction area to book your first series. And you can come along this journey and share yours with those that are listening and viewing and just wondering about life and how to get through different segments of their life like David has, and relating his college experiences, relating his high school, his middle school, all the way up through the military band system and now. Especially if you listen to our podcasts that we have before and after these recorded videos. Really great information, as well as if you could actually name that Easter egg that's in the video right there.
I'll be very impressed if you do, by the way. Very impressed.
That'd be very awesome. And I might have to put a kind of a prize support or something like that. Maybe for if someone, you know what, that'd be a really cool incentive. Why not I do this? Okay, for those that actually know what that Easter egg is in the picture, for those that the first person that lists it at the time of this recording, October 19, 2023, when I actually post this, should be today, because it's the third in the series. You can find all the videos on his page that I've listed below and in the links below. For the first person that names it, whether they see this video on Facebook and gets it right, and so whether you see that answer first or not, and correlate that with me, I will send them the podcast segment to these to your series, all three that you've had so far, so they can be the first to listen in on those podcast segments before I release. And that's only good till I release those, and then, you know, all hands off deck there. But as far as that goes, thank you everyone for participating, watching, and getting to experience David Werden's journey from the beginning through now to his 5th year in the Coast Guard band, and getting to play alongside of Dennis Winter, and getting to share Phil's story and Art's story, and kind of the beginnings of the Coast Guard congressional band. As you know, I never knew as a military musician myself, the formation and kind of the reverence that each of the service bands has. That's really cool and great insight. David, thank you so much for joining us in this series and being a part of our cohort. Absolutely.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you folks for listening.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. See you next time.